Hello dear learners, today we will try to know more about the great movement called the Renaissance. In order to evolve as a fine human being, one has to experience the different phases of life, the society we live in, the culture, our own maturity levels to understand the subtle aspects of life, the outlook towards life and self matter a lot. These experiences ignite the learning process which at times is in a dormant stage. Italy experienced similar changes and became a platform where a great movement that emphasized on learning and created awareness among the writers. The writers in turn tried to educate people by highlighting the importance of learning through their literary works. Renaissance, a movement which marked the significance of learning, made its beginning in Italy in the 14th century. A rebirth of learning that inspired people to explore intellectual and geographical horizons with special focus on classical antiquity. Both kinds of discovery resulted in changes of tremendous import for the Western civilization. This period can also be described as a cultural and artistic movement. The beginning of the Renaissance is dated as 1485, when Battle of Bosworth Field put an end to Wars of Roses and inaugurated the Tudor dynasty. The impact of thought, style and the changed outlook was slow, and the second half of the 16th century is usually regarded as the height of English Renaissance. Now, let us try to understand what the objectives of this great movement were. And I am sure by the end of this session, you will be able to list out the characteristic traits of Renaissance movement, describe it as a cultural and artistic movement, and critically analyze the major issues of the movement and throw light on element of humanism that earmarked the movement. Let us quickly summarize what this great movement consisted of or was made up of. This lesson summarizes the significant characteristics of the golden era of learning called the Renaissance. It introduces the reader to a lofty movement that brought about the drastic change in the outlook of people of Italy towards life. Their quest for learning became so intense that they moved away from the passive and gloomy literature of Middle Ages and tried to embrace modern active life that gave some meaning to their jest and exploration. The major issues that manifested during Renaissance reflected the evolved culture, appetite for exploration and enthusiasm to create new literature. The era also showed that people did not completely move away from certain practices of Middle Ages and tried to continue along with the new ideas. The pragmatic approach and the passion to reform society were the hallmarks of Renaissance. The word Renaissance can be construed as rebirth. Italy became the Rome of Renaissance. The movement brought in a refined change in the outlook among the people of Italy towards life and learning. The inquiring minds became active, and the zest for exploring intellectual and geographical dimension was at its peak. Renaissance thinkers showed immense interest in classical antiquity, and there was a deviation from gloomy literature of the Middle Ages. Petrarch and Boccaccio were among the earliest of the humanists, and their work is described as the dawn of Renaissance. The great scientists like Copernicus attempted to prove that the sun was the center point of the planetary system and tried to unearth the mysterious layers of the ignorant world. In religion, people like John Wycliffe, John Huss in Bohemia, that is modern Czechoslovakia, and Martin Luther fought against the evils of the church and the papal authority. The Renaissance minds considered themselves as modern in their outlook and displayed characteristics such as inquiring, learning, and exploring. They disliked the negativity and gloominess that was spread through the writers of the Middle Ages. In order to understand different shades of Renaissance, we need to analyze 5 major interrelated issues. The study unfolds the different phases and contexts of the age and excites the learner to explore further, and I am sure you are all excited. And these 5 issues are: the first one, the Renaissance thinkers always gave utmost importance to classical antiquity and drifted away from the Middle Ages, but they moved on with one belief of the past, and that was the great chain of being. The second one was the significant political changes that impacted the society. Third one, introduction of a lofty movement called Humanism. Creation of a platform for literary works, the literary doctrine of imitation. And fifth one, and the last one, a religious movement called Reformation. The thinkers of the movement introduced optimism that instilled hope and interest in people to live. They moved away from the negativity of the Middle Ages, which was predominant throughout. According to them, the Middle Ages were set in the middle of the 2 important historical periods, one that reflected classical antiquity and their own. Despite all the trials of disassociation from the gloominess of the Middle Ages, modern scholars have noted that extremely important continuities with the previous age still existed. Now let us look into what the great chain of being means. Among all the significant connects or continuities with the classical period was the concept of the great chain of being. The very basis and essence of this concept was that every particle in the universe is divinely placed, and these were placed according to a hierarchy that graded different objects, both animate and inanimate. The division started with metals at the bottom, 4 elements: earth, water, air and fire. The vegetative class like trees, flowers, etc. climbed the ladder first. Then came animals, followed by humans and angels. The highest position was occupied by God. The ranking was accurate and apt at all levels and segments, that is from lower to higher. The most beautiful aspect of this concept was independence with universal interdependence. Freedom gets its meaning and essence and momentum from interdependence. According to the thinkers of the Renaissance, humans represented the microcosm and the 4 elements of the universe represented the macrocosm. The microcosm, though apart, looks complete, a structure that appears perfect. But actually it is not and is still a part of whole, that is macrocosm. The humans who represent the microcosm have elements of the macrocosm, that is earth, water, air, fire. These 4 substances housed in the human body are called humors, a perfect example of interdependence, a significant principle of nature. How beautiful the definition of interdependence is. This hierarchy was termed as universal orderliness. When this orderliness is disturbed, there is an imbalanced pattern in human thoughts, actions and deeds. Some noted examples are immortal characters of Shakespeare like King Lear and his lunacy and the power-hungry Macbeth. There was a raging storm internally as external forces of nature exhibited imbalance. Though the writers of the Renaissance did try to showcase orderliness, through their writings, the theme of disorder did find way, making it evident that the Renaissance movement did experience upheaval of traditional systems of hierarchy. According to the chain of being concept, all existing things are aptly positioned in the universe. Any deviation from the divine order was to betray one's own nature, thus creating imbalances between the self and the outside world. This also gives us a very strong message that how important it is to understand our own self. Some other writers of the Renaissance were also fascinated by the imagination of superhuman powers as depicted by Christopher Marlowe in Dr. Faustus. Works of this kind also indicate that they moved away from the rigid framework of an organized universe. The writers display the lofty human spirit or aspiration soaring high and unquenchable thirst for human powers. Look at the huge dimensions of human mind. Though we possess it, we still don't understand the hidden powers of human mind. That's the beauty of divinity. Political implications of chain of being. What do you mean by this, or what do we understand by this? Though the writers and thinkers of the Renaissance were for orderliness of the universe, the fear of disorder was lurking in their minds. They were quite scared and they could ignore it as it has strong political outcomes. The very idea of deviating from the given position and place to rise in terms of power was useful to political rulers, for it helped to strengthen their authority. The inference was the great chain of being was broken. It was a sin against Almighty according to the doctrine of correspondences, wherever rulers claimed to rule by divine right. To put in simple words, whenever and wherever a sin was committed, there were cosmic disturbances. This notion was quite popular before Halley's theory about periodic orbits, comets as well as meteors were thought to be disorderly heavenly bodies. Renaissance brought a positive change in putting an end to feudalism, the medieval form of political organization. It made people realize that there was a need for fair and strong political rule, and very effectively established central government both in the north and in the south. National monarchies gained strong foothold in the political world, headed by kings, especially in England and France. Wealthy oligarchic families came to power in Italy and headed the territorial city-states, a government ruled by small body of individuals. This change also indicated that it was akin to the concept of the great chain of being. This was a principle that guided the rulers for long and described the ideals of great rulers. There were many other ideals and values that popularized the movement through the literary works of different writers of different creative ideas. But one signature movement that expressed the values of the Renaissance to its fullest was the movement known as Humanism. This became the soul of Renaissance, which emphasized life in this world instead of matters pertaining to the otherworldly spiritual life associated with the Middle Ages. Now let us try to look into the details of what humanism is. The notion of humanism dominated the thought process of writers of the Renaissance, and it became the driving force and the spirit of Renaissance. The movement focused on life in this world instead of on life beyond. Does it not sound interesting? Yes, it is, and mysterious also. The spiritual life associated with the Middle Ages did not convince the writers of the age. According to the terms used in the Renaissance itself, humanism represented a shift from the contemplative life to the active life. These two terms are very significant to understand the great movement of Renaissance. The movement gave utmost importance to the dignity of man and his expanded potential in this life. During the age of Renaissance, unlike the life of the Middle Ages, utmost importance was given to active life. Healthy association with society was highly acknowledged and appreciated. It was considered as a rich value. This applied to all areas of life, be it moral, political, military, or in any service to the state. Just observe how interestingly the changes were seen in that interesting age. Despite disassociation from the Middle Ages, there was a fine blend of traditional and new secular values. In fact, some of the most important humanists like Erasmus were churchmen. The values like personal achievement, thirst for knowledge, and personal aspiration were valued. We can quote Dr. Faustus as an example. The concept of the Renaissance man refers to an individual who, in addition to participating actively in the affairs of public life, possesses knowledge of skill in many subjects or areas. Another key concept of the Renaissance was the doctrine of imitation. This was the common thread that connected the Middle Ages and the movement of Renaissance. The word imitation can be understood in two different ways. One, inference was mirroring life, and the other, following the predecessors. There were certain universal themes which remained original. It was difficult for the writer to come up with something original. Utmost importance was given to originality. We as learners should remember that. And also the goal was not to create something new. The responsibility of the then writers was to translate the available works to explain the essence and moral vision of the past. The only way out was to imitate the great works and adapt them to Christian views and environment and present them to the readers. If one looks at the practice of imitation with optimism, it is clear that it has led to the revival of classical literature, classical genres, and significant literary forms. The emphasis was on satire and epic. These genres attracted both the writers and the readers' attention. Other genres which generated interest were comedy and tragedy derived from antiquity. Europe was enjoying its golden era that popularized its literature. The Reformation and literary ramifications. Well, another interesting issue that impacted the great movement. The Renaissance took the form of a revolution, especially in the sphere of religion. This streak of revolution was called Reformation. A dangerous mix of the questioning spirit combined with the people's repulsion with the evils of the church and clergy led to the denial of papal authority and the formation of nation states. Though the Protestants and the Catholics were humanists, they seemed to reject the medieval form of Christianity. A 16th century German monk, Martin Luther, raised his voice against church corruption. A similar kind of satiric strokes found their way into Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. These developments reflect the pragmatic and modern outlook of society. The concept of humanism had already found a strong foothold in the society. The impact was immense and was evident in every activity of the age. There were also Catholics like Erasmus, a Dutchman of Rotterdam, who wanted to bring changes in the church from within. But Martin Luther's deviation from the church policy and his disagreement with fundamental doctrines of the church forced him to move away from the church along with his followers in protest, and they were called Protestants. Among the most important tenets of Protestants were the rejection of papal authority and the priests of the church to mediate between humans and the God. Finally, there was realization, awareness among people and the writers of then society. People strictly believed that churches do not have power to grant salvation. It is the element of divinity that is found in the individual and his or her good deeds that will ensure what? Salvation. This claim of the church to grant salvation to individuals was understood as exploitation. Some Protestants believed to the extent that humans have stooped down to such an extent that they do not deserve a divine grace called salvation. Just observe how much importance was given to this concept of salvation or idea called salvation. The literary ramifications during this period were also worth analyzing. They impacted the writers and thinkers of the great movement. Two consequences that stand out as very important speak volumes about the way the literary world was affected. The first one was the rejection of the authority of the church, and the Bible was considered as the ultimate authority. This shows that people slowly started believing in spiritual nature of the world. The second was the need for translating the Bible into the vernacular languages which caught the attention of general public. The initiative was taken to translate and make it available to laymen. Oh, that was a yeoman service done by the writers of that age. At the same time, some Protestants also argued and stressed the need to understand the Bible written in its original languages, Hebrew and Greek, so that it could be properly translated. So, the efforts to create awareness among laymen began. The Catholics wanted to preserve it in Latin. Thus, the Bible became a renewed source of literary inspiration both in form and matter. It also became a rich source to study symbols. Now, let us see to what extent the writers of the Renaissance contributed to this great movement through their literary works. European literature that spread its roots in Italy is also termed as Renaissance literature. It made a beginning in the 14th century and spread across Europe in the 17th century. The printing press by Johannes Gutenberg was a boon to the local authors who preferred to write in vernacular rather than Greek or Latin. Use of vernacular languages attracted large number of people to reading, and this audience in turn promoted the ideas of Renaissance. The year 1557 celebrated the first fruits of Renaissance in the form of a famous collection of songs and sonnets by White and Surrey. They became a kind of role models for playwrights like Shakespeare and other contemporary writers. Tottle's Miscellany, named after its publishers, also found its way to popularity. English prose also gained popularity during the Renaissance period and was used in various fields like history, politics, education, sermons, religions, controversies, and above all, translation of the Bible. Well, the printing press was a great boon and it was a blessing in disguise. People took to reading. They showed interest in learning. The pioneers who adopted prose writing were humanists, and they were divided into three groups. The first group was called as the Oxford Humanists, the second the Educationists, and the third translators of the Bible. Thomas More wrote Utopia in Latin in 1516 and contributed as an Oxford humanist. A new era started in 1579 with Edward Spencer's Shepherd's Calendar, and his Fairy Queen reigned supreme as a masterpiece. The poem and the drama became popular forms during the Renaissance. Milton's Paradise Lost and Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella, Apology for Poetry, and Arcadia added their grandeur to the world of English literature. It was a royal treat to the readers. Though morality as a tool was the focal point for the humanists for their own purpose early in the 16th century, it manifested in its fullest form in 1550, and the classics influenced English drama completely. The first English comedy was Ralph Roister Doister by Nicholas Udall, headmaster of Eton. The huge canvas of English literature was painted with variety of colors. Apart from the individual forms, there was a medley of two or more forms. What are they? Morality, interlude, history, romance, classical tragedy, farce, etc. Look at the creativity, look at the variety of forms that made Renaissance a rich movement. However, the Renaissance writers and thinkers provided a field of exercise for the national dramatic genius who made the great outbursts of Elizabethan drama in Shakespeare and others possible. Now, let us conclude what we have learnt from this great movement called the Renaissance. The movement of Renaissance created awareness among people of the 14th century. It made people realize that a modern and pragmatic outlook was necessary to evolve. They came up with their concept of modernism by disassociating themselves from the theories and perspectives of the Middle Ages. The writers and the thinkers of Renaissance made people realize that the churches were not responsible for their salvation, but reading the Holy Bible and their good deeds alone were responsible. The churches were instrumental only in providing the required ambience for spiritual practices. The movement of Renaissance led to Reformation. The revolutionary writers like Erasmus, Martin Luther, and John Wycliffe tried to curb corruption by fighting against the policies of the church. Look at the realization. The Christians, based on different argument and theories, formed two groups. What are they? Catholics and Protestants. The Renaissance thinkers and writers came with 5 major issues which instilled life into passive society. It was not confined to 14th century. The writers took care that the great knowledge should be passed on to the coming generations. The subtle blend was very much evident. It aided the Renaissance writers who later created the world of literature, which was an eternal platform for different writers of various genres. The major issues which caught the attention of the social and the literary world were the great chain of being, political implications of the chain of being. Third one was humanism, the doctrine of imitation, and the Reformation and literary ramifications. The intellectual dimensions explored included the orderliness and disorderliness of internal and external nature. The relevant themes and concepts manifested in various masterpieces of literature. Individual aspirations focused on active life and social participation, emphasis on life, in this world rather than the world beyond interested people. But the age also saw people who aspired for superhuman power and eternal thirst for learning. There was a quest to evolve as better humans, and the preferred channel to evolve learning was with a human touch. How beautiful and how learned the movement was, people were. The kind of contribution that was done by the great writers, I think as learners, we owe them a lot. We are indebted to these great writers forever. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the movement, the Great Renaissance. Now let's conclude what we have learned from this great movement called the Renaissance. The movement of Renaissance created awareness among people of the 14th century. It made people realize that a modern and pragmatic outlook was necessary to evolve. They came up with their concept of modernism by disassociating themselves from the theories and perspectives of the Middle Ages. The writers and the thinkers of Renaissance made people realize that the churches were not responsible for their salvation, but reading the Holy Bible and their good deeds alone were responsible. The churches were instrumental only in providing the required ambience for spiritual practices. The movement of Renaissance led to Reformation. The revolutionary writers like Erasmus, Martin Luther and John Wycliffe tried to curb corruption by fighting against the policies of the church. Look at the realization. The Christians, based on different argument and theories, formed two groups. What are they? Catholics and Protestants. The Renaissance thinkers and writers came with 5 major issues which instilled life into passive society. It was not confined to 14th century. The writers took care that the great knowledge should be passed on to the coming generations. The subtle blend was very much evident. It aided the Renaissance writers who later created the world of literature, which was an eternal platform for different writers of various genres. The major issues which caught the attention of the social and the literary world were the great chain of being, political implications of the chain of being. Third one was humanism, the doctrine of imitation, and the Reformation and literary ramifications. The intellectual dimensions explored included the orderliness and disorderliness of internal and external nature. The relevant themes and concepts manifested in various masterpieces of literature. Individual aspirations focused on active life and social participation, emphasis on life in this world rather than the world beyond interested people. But the age also saw people who aspired for superhuman power and eternal thirst for learning. There was a quest to evolve as better humans, and the preferred channel to evolve learning was with a human touch. How beautiful and how learned the movement was, people were. The kind of contribution that was done by the great writers, I think as learners, we owe them a lot. We are indebted to these great writers forever. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the movement, the Great Renaissance.